She replaced me loudly, then discovered I had quietly become the man she could never reach again. Section 1. The kind of love that arrives too fast. I should have known that a fire starting this quickly usually leaves nothing but gray ash behind, yet I chose to stand in the heat anyway. Ava Sinclair didn't just enter my life, she collided with it at a velocity that made the rest of the world seem static and dull. We met at a rooftop gallery in Lower Manhattan, the kind of place where people go to be seen rather than to see art. When our eyes met across a room filled with expensive suits and forced laughter, the noise simply died away. She walked toward me with a confidence that felt like a challenge, her smile promising a depth I hadn't encountered before. Why did I think I was the exception to the rule of gravity? I felt the pull immediately, a magnetic force that bypassed my logic and went straight for my ego. The first 3 months were a whirlwind of late-night drives through the city and whispered promises in corners of dimly lit bars where the music was too loud to hear anything else. Ava had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, a skill I now realize was practiced to perfection. "Julian, you're different from the others," she told me one evening while we watched the sun set over the Hudson. I stayed silent because I wanted to believe her, even though the logical part of my brain was screaming that I was just the latest protagonist in her recurring drama. I realized later that people who love this intensely are often just in love with the reflection of themselves in your eyes. We moved with a speed that concerned my closest friend, Ethan Cross, who watched our progression with a wary, calculated distance. He saw the way I was folding my life into hers, discarding my own routines to accommodate her spontaneous whims and late-night cravings for excitement. "Slow down, Julian," he cautioned me over a quiet drink. "The faster the ascent, the more painful the inevitable crash." I dismissed his concerns as cynicism, convinced that what Ava and I shared was a rare, once-in-a-lifetime connection that defied standard social pacing. That was the moment I understood how dangerous hope can be when it isn't tethered to reality. I was building a skyscraper on a foundation of shifting sand, ignoring the cracks that were already beginning to form beneath my feet. The intensity of our relationship became our brand, a public display of affection and synchronized living that made others feel inadequate in comparison. We were the couple that everyone talked about, the one that seemed to have bypassed the awkward stages of dating to reach a level of soul-deep intimacy. Ava would post photos of us, capturing moments that felt private but were curated for an audience I didn't yet realize she needed. Did I love her, or did I love the version of myself that she presented to the world? I found myself performing for the camera, for our friends, and eventually for her, as the weight of maintaining this perfection began to press down on my shoulders. Social circles are like ecosystems. They require balance to survive, and our rapid rise was starting to disrupt the local hierarchy. Madeline Price, one of Ava's oldest friends, watched us with an expression that I couldn't quite decipher at the time, a mix of pity and dark anticipation. She had seen this cycle before, the way Ava would consume a person's identity until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. I stayed silent because I felt I had something to prove, a need to show that I could handle the fire without getting burned. I didn't realize that the heat was already starting to blister my skin, hidden beneath the tailored shirts and the smiles I wore like armor. Our conversations began to shift from the future to the present, focusing more on the logistics of our social calendar than the substance of our shared values. Ava started to mention a name I hadn't heard before, Noah Blake, a man who moved in the same high-stakes circles we frequented. She spoke of his success and his refreshing perspective on the industry, her voice carrying a light, melodic quality that made my chest tighten with an undefined anxiety. "He's just a colleague, Julian," she said when I finally asked, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I realized then that the narrative was changing, the script was being rewritten, and I hadn't been given the new lines. The psychological pressure of trying to keep up with her energy was becoming a silent, exhausting labor that I performed every single day without complaint. I found myself checking her social media, looking for clues in the comments, searching for the moment the "we" became me again in her public persona. The status threat was subtle at first, a slight cooling of her touch, a few more minutes spent on her phone during our private dinners. I felt the social imbalance shifting, the leverage moving from my hands into hers as I became the one chasing and she became the one leading. Why does the person who cares the least always hold the most power in a relationship? As the weeks passed, the passion that had once felt like an engine began to feel like a cage, restricting my movements and clouding my judgment. I noticed how she would light up when her phone buzzed, a sharp contrast to the way she looked at me when we were alone in the quiet of my apartment. The restraint I practiced was a choice, a way to maintain my dignity even as I felt the ground disappearing from beneath me. I stayed silent because I didn't want to be the one to break the spell, even though I knew the illusion was already shattered beyond repair. That was the moment I understood the difference between being loved and being used as a placeholder. Ethan saw the change in me, the way I was withdrawing into a cold, observational shell to protect what little was left of my peace. He didn't say, "I told you so," but his silence was more deafening than any lecture he could have given me about the dangers of fast-burning love. I was starting to see the architecture of the betrayal before it even happened, noticing the way Ava would mention Noah's brilliant ideas during our Sunday morning coffee. The pressure was mounting, a silent scream in a crowded room as I waited for the other shoe to drop in this carefully constructed play. The final night of this section was a quiet one, or so it seemed on the surface, as we sat together on the balcony of our shared life. Ava was looking at her phone, the blue light reflecting in her eyes, making her look cold and distant, like a stranger I had accidentally invited into my home. I looked at her and realized that I didn't recognize the woman sitting across from me anymore. She had become a ghost of the person I thought I knew. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask the question that had been burning in my throat for weeks, but I stopped. If I asked the question, I would have to hear the answer, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for the silence that would follow. Section 2. Passion always attracts an audience. The public display of our romance had created a gallery of spectators who were now waiting for the first sign of a crack in the frame. We attended a gala for a prominent tech firm, an event where the air was thick with ambition and the scent of expensive perfume. Ava was in her element, moving through the crowd like a queen, while I followed a few paces behind, feeling more like a bodyguard than a partner. I saw Madeline Price whispering to a group of women near the bar, their eyes flickering toward me with a synchronized, practiced sympathy. I realized then that in the eyes of our social circle, I was already a ghost, a relic of a season that was rapidly coming to an end. Noah Blake was there, standing at the center of a small, admiring circle, his laughter cutting through the room with an easy, unearned authority. He was everything the world told men they should be, tall, wealthy, and utterly indifferent to the feelings of those around him. When Ava introduced us, she didn't call me her partner, she called me Julian, a subtle but devastating shift in nomenclature that signaled my demotion. I stayed silent because I wanted to observe the mechanics of her attraction, to see exactly what he offered that I had apparently failed to provide. That was the moment I understood that status isn't just about what you have, but about who you are seen with. The rest of the evening was a masterclass in psychological warfare, conducted with smiles and light touches that never quite crossed the line into impropriety. Ava spent more time talking to Noah than she did to me, her body language angled toward him in a way that excluded me from the conversation. I felt the social imbalance like a physical weight, a pressure in my chest that made it difficult to breathe even in the large, open ballroom. He's very impressive, isn't he? Madeline whispered in my ear as she passed by, her voice dripping with a cruel, calculated sweetness. I realized that everyone in this room was watching the transition happen in real time, and I was the only one expected to pretend it wasn't happening. Internal monologue is a lonely place when the world outside is screaming your failure, and I found myself retreating further into the shadows of my own mind. I stayed silent because any reaction I gave would only serve to validate their perception of me as the losing party in this social exchange. I watched Noah put a hand on Ava's arm to emphasize a point, and I saw her lean into the touch, a movement so natural it felt like a betrayal of every private moment we had shared. Why do we stay in rooms where we are being systematically erased? I was waiting for a sign, a reason to fight or a reason to leave, but the only thing I found was a growing sense of my own invisibility. Ethan Cross found me near the balcony, away from the noise and the prying eyes of the crowd that had once cheered for my relationship. "You don't have to stay for the finale, Julian," he said quietly, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a rare display of genuine affection. I looked back at the room, at Ava laughing at something Noah had said, and I felt a coldness settle over me that had nothing to do with the night air. I realized that the passion we had shared was never meant to last. It was a performance designed to attract an audience, and now that the audience was bored, the lead actress was looking for a new co-star. The social pressure continued to mount as the night wore on, with more people gravitating toward Noah and Ava, forming a new center of gravity that left me on the periphery. I saw Rachel Vaughn, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper observations, watching the scene with a look of detached amusement. She caught my eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging my participation in a tragedy that everyone else was treating as a comedy. I stayed silent because I knew that any word I spoke would be dissected and discussed in the morning, a footnote in the story of my own public humiliation. I began to see the patterns in Ava's behavior, the way she mirrored Noah's interests, and adopted his vocabulary, just as she had once done with mine. It was a form of emotional mimicry, a way for her to integrate herself into the lives of those she deemed valuable, leaving them behind when their utility was exhausted. I realized then that I wasn't being replaced because of a flaw in my character, but because I had served my purpose in her narrative. The pain was still there, sharp and jagged, but it was being tempered by a growing sense of clarity about the woman I had loved. That was the moment I understood that silence wasn't just a reaction, it was a strategy. The drive home was silent, a stark contrast to the music and laughter that had filled our early days together, the air in the car thick with things unsaid. Ava stared out the window, her mind clearly miles away, perhaps already planning her next move in the game she was playing with Noah. I didn't ask her about the gala, and she didn't offer any explanations, the distance between us growing with every mile we traveled toward our shared, hollow home. I felt the rising psychological pressure of the inevitable confrontation, the moment where the lies would have to be spoken aloud to be discarded. But as I looked at her profile in the passing streetlights, I decided that I wouldn't be the one to start the fire this time. In our apartment, she went straight to her phone, the soft clicks of her typing sounding like a countdown in the quiet room. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching her, wondering if she even remembered that I was still there, a physical presence in her curated life. "Noah wants us to join them for a weekend in the Hamptons," she said without looking up, her voice casual, as if she were discussing the weather. I stayed silent because the "us" in her sentence felt like a lie, a thin veil of politeness draped over a decision she had already made for herself. I realized that the weekend wasn't about a trip. It was about the final public transition from me to him. As I lay in bed that night, the darkness felt heavier than usual, a cold shroud that seemed to press the air out of my lungs. I could hear the faint sound of her breathing next to me, a rhythm that was no longer in sync with my own, a reminder of the chasm that had opened between us. I stayed silent because words were no longer enough to bridge the gap, and I wasn't interested in a compromise that would require me to lose even more of myself. I looked at the ceiling and began to formulate a plan, not for revenge, but for survival, a way to disappear without leaving a trace of the man I used to be. The last thing I saw before I closed my eyes was a flash of a message on her nightstand, a name that confirmed everything I already knew. Section 3. I felt replaced before I was left. The atmosphere in our apartment didn't turn cold all at once. It happened in degrees, like a season shifting while you're too busy to notice the leaves dying. I woke up one Tuesday morning to the sound of Ava laughing. Not at me, and certainly not with me, but at a voice coming through her AirPods. She was in the kitchen making an elaborate smoothie, her movements quick and energized in a way they hadn't been for months. I stood in the doorway watching her, realizing that I was witnessing a person who had already moved into a new future while still inhabiting my present. Why does the sound of someone else's joy feel like a physical blow when you know you aren't the source of it? I stayed silent because I wanted to see how long she could maintain the charade of us. Every interaction we had was now filtered through the invisible presence of Noah Blake, a ghost who sat at our dinner table and slept in the spaces between our words. Ava began using phrases that weren't hers, adopting a pseudo-intellectual tone that smelled of Noah's corporate influence and high society arrogance. "We need to think about our personal brands, Julian. We're becoming stagnant," she said over a dinner she barely touched, her eyes flickering toward her phone every 30 seconds. I realized then that I wasn't just losing a girlfriend. I was being audited and found lacking by a woman who viewed relationships as equity. That was the moment I understood that in her eyes, I was no longer an asset to be displayed, but a liability to be liquidated. The psychological pressure of being a spectator in my own life began to manifest as a sharp, constant clarity that stripped away my remaining illusions. I watched her get ready for work meetings that lasted until midnight, her choice of perfume becoming bolder, her outfits more calculated to impress a man who wasn't me. I didn't check her phone, and I didn't follow her because the truth was written in the way she pulled her hand away when I reached for it. Socially, the shift was even more aggressive. Our mutual friends began to speak to me with a careful, measured pity that felt like a funeral rehearsal. Have you ever felt the world preparing for your absence before you've even walked out the door? Madeline Price called me one afternoon, her voice a mix of feigned concern and predatory curiosity that made my skin crawl with a desire to hang up. "Julian, honey, are you okay? We saw Ava and Noah at that new lounge in Soho last night. They looked very close," she said, trailing off to let the implication hang in the air like a noose. I stayed silent because giving her a reaction was exactly what they all wanted, a messy, emotional breakdown to justify their betrayal. I realized that my restraint was the only thing I had left, a silent wall that they couldn't climb or break through no matter how hard they pushed. The pressure was rising, but I refused to let the steam escape. I was becoming a pressure cooker of observation and quiet, burning intent. The internal monologue in my head became a repetitive cycle of "not yet" and "wait for it," a mantra that kept me grounded while my heart was being systematically dismantled. I watched Ava come home one night, her hair slightly disheveled and her eyes bright with a secret thrill that she didn't bother to hide from me anymore. "You're still up?" she asked, her voice devoid of the warmth that used to define our late-night conversations, replaced by a cold, clinical indifference. I realized then that she wasn't even afraid of being caught. She was waiting for me to be the difficult one so she could leave with a clean conscience. That was the moment I understood the cruelty of someone who wants you to end it so they don't have to be the villain. The silence in the apartment became a character of its own, a heavy, suffocating presence that followed me from room to room, mocking the life we had built together. I started moving my things, small items at first, books I'd finished, clothes I rarely wore, into a storage unit without saying a word to her. I was building a bridge to a new life in the dark, one brick at a time, while she was busy burning the old one down with her new flame. Did she notice the shelf in the office was emptier? Did she see that my favorite watch was gone? I realized that she was too focused on her new horizon to notice the ground disappearing beneath her current one. One evening, I found a receipt for a piece of jewelry in the trash, a brand I didn't buy for a price I couldn't afford, tucked under a pile of takeout containers. I didn't confront her, and I didn't throw it in her face. I simply folded it and put it back, a tiny piece of evidence in a trial that would never have a jury. The rising psychological pressure was no longer about her betrayal, but about my own capacity to endure it without breaking my silence. I stayed silent because a single word of anger would have been a gift to her, a way to balance the scales of her guilt. I realized that my lack of reaction was driving her more insane than a shouting match ever could have. Ethan Cross stopped by, his eyes scanning the room and landing on the subtle signs of my quiet departure, his expression one of grim, silent approval. "The ghosting of a life," he whispered when Ava was in the other room. "It's a powerful move, Julian. Most men would have burned the place down by now." I looked at him and realized that I didn't want fire. I wanted a vacuum, a space so empty that when she finally turned around to look for me, there would be nothing left to hold on to. The status threat was no longer an issue because I had already opted out of the game they were playing. That was the moment I understood that you can't lose a race you've already stopped running. The section reached its peak on a Friday night, the air outside thick with the humidity of a looming New York summer storm that mirrored the tension in the room. Ava was packing a small weekend bag, her movements efficient and practiced, her mind already halfway to the Hamptons with Noah and his circle of elite vultures. "I'll be back Sunday night, Julian. Try to get out and see some friends, okay?" she said, her voice dripping with a condescension that felt like a physical slap. I stayed silent because the okay she wanted was a permission slip for her infidelity, a way for her to pretend that we were still fine while she was being replaced. I realized that this was the last time she would ever see me in this apartment, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a goodbye. As she walked toward the door, she stopped for a second, her hand on the handle, as if sensing the finality of the moment but unable to articulate why. She turned to look at me, her face a mask of beautiful, hollow ambition, searching my eyes for a spark of the man who used to worship her every move. I looked back with a calm, steady gaze that revealed nothing, a mirror that reflected back only her own emptiness and the choices she had made. "Is there something you want to say?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly with a sudden, unexpected flicker of doubt that I hadn't seen in months. I realized that the trap was set, and all I had to do was remain exactly as I was, a silent witness to her departure. Section 4. What hurt more than the ending? The door clicked shut, and the sound echoed through the apartment like a gunshot in a cathedral, marking the official end of a life I no longer recognized as mine. I didn't cry, and I didn't collapse. I simply stood in the center of the living room and felt the weight of her presence evaporate, leaving behind a silence that was finally peaceful. I realized that the ending of a relationship isn't the moment the person leaves, but the moment you stop caring where they are going. That was the moment I understood that her departure wasn't a loss of my value, but a restoration of my autonomy. I stayed silent because there was no one left to hear me, and for the first time in a year, that felt like a victory. I spent the next 48 hours systematically erasing myself from the space we had shared, a process that was as clinical and cold as a surgical procedure. I didn't leave a note, and I didn't leave a mess. I simply took what was mine and left the rest as a monument to the woman she had become. The psychological pressure of the big talk was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused energy as I transitioned my life to a small, sleek apartment in a neighborhood she hated. I realized that the most powerful thing you can do to a person who expects a scene is to give them a void. Why do we think we owe an explanation to those who didn't value our presence enough to stay? The transition was invisible to the outside world, a ghost move that left my social media silent and my phone calls unreturned, creating a vacuum that my friends didn't know how to fill. I saw Madeline Price's name pop up on my screen a dozen times, her texts becoming increasingly frantic as she realized she had lost her front row seat to my humiliation. I stayed silent because I knew that every unanswered message was a thorn in their side, a denial of the closure they needed to feel superior. I realized that by disappearing, I was rewriting the narrative from the guy who got cheated on to the man who moved on without a word. That was the moment I understood that mystery is the ultimate form of social leverage. The actual pain didn't come from her being with Noah. It came from the realization that I had let myself be diminished for a love that was as shallow as a reflection. I sat in my new, sparsely furnished living room, looking out at a different skyline, and felt the raw, jagged edges of my own ego beginning to heal in the quiet. I realized that I had been complicit in my own erasure, playing the role of the supportive partner while she was auditioning for a better life. The rising psychological pressure was now internal, a drive to rebuild not for revenge but to prove to myself that I was more than a supporting character. Have you ever felt the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose and everything to gain? On Sunday night, I knew she would be returning to the old apartment, expecting to find me there, perhaps waiting with a sad look or a list of grievances she could easily dismiss. I imagined her turning the key, walking into the dark, quiet space, and slowly realizing that the furniture I had provided and the life I had curated were gone. I stayed silent because I wanted her to experience the full weight of the emptiness she had created, without the distraction of a fight or a final conversation. I realized that her power over me had always been dependent on my presence, and by removing myself, I had rendered her weapons useless. That was the moment I understood that the most devastating response to betrayal is total, unexplained absence. Rachel Vaughn was the only one who figured it out, sending me a short, cryptic email 2 weeks after I vanished from the scene. "Well played, Julian. They're all talking and no one knows what to say." "It's the most interesting thing you've ever done," she wrote, her tone one of genuine, albeit dark, respect. I didn't reply because even a thank you would be a break in the silence I was cultivating as my new foundation for strength. I realized that I was no longer a victim in their story. I was a question mark, a riddle that they would spend months trying to solve while I was already building my next chapter. The pressure had shifted from me to them, a quiet, growing unease that I could feel even from across the city. I focused on my work with a cold, relentless precision that I hadn't felt in years, my professional success becoming the only metric of my existence that mattered. I realized that while Ava was busy being a trophy on Noah's arm, I was becoming the man who owned the shelf the trophy sat on. My bank account grew as my social circle shrank, the silence of my personal life providing the clarity I needed to dominate a market I had previously only participated in. I stayed silent because I didn't need to announce my wins. I let the results speak for me in rooms where my name was still being whispered. That was the moment I understood that competence is the most dignified form of dominance. The internal monologue of my recovery was less about, why did she do it? And more about, who will I become now that she's gone? I started to see the world through a lens of cold utility, valuing people for their loyalty and their intellect rather than their social standing or their aesthetic appeal. I realized that I had been living in a curated dream, and the awakening, though painful, was the greatest gift Ava Sinclair ever gave me. The psychological pressure of the past was being replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of a future I was building with my own hands. Why does it take a total collapse to see the structural flaws in the life you thought was perfect? I saw a photo of them a month later. Noah and Ava at a high-profile charity event, her hand on his chest, her smile wide and practiced for the cameras. She looked beautiful, but to me, she looked like a polished antique something that belonged in a museum of a life I had already outgrown. I stayed silent because looking at her didn't trigger anger or longing anymore. It triggered a profound sense of relief that I was no longer the one holding her up. I realized that Noah hadn't won a prize. He had inherited a burden, and I was the only one who knew how heavy it actually was. That was the moment I understood that the best revenge is letting them have exactly what they wanted. The section ends with me sitting in a high-end restaurant, alone by choice, watching a group of people who looked exactly like the life I had left behind. My phone buzzed on the table, a private number, one I hadn't blocked because I knew, eventually, the curiosity would overcome the pride. I didn't answer it, but I watched it ring until the screen went dark, the silence of the room returning like a trusted friend. I realized that the person on the other end was starting to feel the first chill of the winter I had left behind in that apartment. The question wasn't what I would say if I picked up, but how much longer she could stand the sound of her own voice in a room where I no longer existed. Section 5. Disappearing without explaining yourself. Silence is a mirror that reflects the insecurities of those who fear it, and I spent the next 6 months turning that mirror toward the world I had left behind. I didn't just leave an apartment, I exited a frequency, a social vibration that required constant noise and validation to exist. My new life was built on a foundation of early mornings, cold focus, and a total refusal to explain my absence to anyone who didn't contribute to my growth. I realized that the need to clear the air is often just a trap set by the guilty to alleviate their own discomfort. Why do we feel obligated to provide a roadmap of our healing to the people who caused the wounds? I stayed silent because my mystery was becoming more expensive than their drama. The psychological pressure was no longer on me to perform, but on them to understand why I had stopped playing their game. I heard through Ethan Cross that Ava's public narrative was beginning to fray at the edges, the happy couple image she projected with Noah lacking the substance of a real connection. She had expected me to be the bitter ex-boyfriend, the one who sent long, late-night texts or made scenes at the clubs we used to frequent. Instead, she got nothing. No likes, no blocks, just a digital and physical void where a person used to be. That was the moment I understood that being forgotten is a choice, and being a ghost is a position of absolute power. I focused my energy on a private equity venture I had been quietly developing in the shadows of my previous life, a project that required the kind of discipline Ava's lifestyle had always sabotaged. I worked from a minimalist office that overlooked the city, a space where the air felt clean and the only opinions that mattered were the numbers on my screen. I realized that competence is the only currency that doesn't lose its value when the market of human emotion crashes. The internal monologue of my days shifted from, "How could she?" to "How much further can I go?" a transformation that felt like waking up from a long, feverish dream. Have you ever noticed how much energy you waste trying to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding you? The social imbalance was shifting in ways I hadn't anticipated as my absence became a topic of conversation in the very circles that had initially dismissed me. Madeline Price tried to check in through mutual acquaintances, her curiosity disguised as concern, but I remained a closed book with no chapters available for her review. I stayed silent because I knew that any information I gave them would be used to build a straw man they could comfortably look down upon. I realized that by denying them a reaction, I was forcing them to confront their own boredom and the hollowness of their own social standing. That was the moment I understood that a man who needs nothing from others is a man they can never truly control. The status threat was now moving in reverse. As my professional reputation grew in rooms that Noah Blake couldn't enter, his perceived dominance began to look like a facade. I started appearing on shortlists for major acquisitions, my name spoken in the quiet, wood-paneled offices where real power is brokered, not just displayed for social media. I saw Rachel Vaughn at a corporate function, a woman who saw through the theater of New York society, and she merely raised a glass to me from across the room. I stayed silent because we both knew that I had transitioned from a participant in the play to a shareholder in the theater itself. Why does it feel so much better to be respected by the serious than to be envied by the superficial? Ava began to reach out, not with apologies, but with small, tactical breadcrumbs designed to test if the door was still unlocked. A happy birthday, text at midnight, saw this, and thought of you, linked to a song we once liked, all sent into the dark abyss of my non-response. I realized that she wasn't missing me. She was missing the version of herself that I had validated through my devotion. I stayed silent because answering her would be like giving a drowning person a hand only to let them pull you under the water with them. The pressure on her was mounting as she realized that she couldn't dial back the clock on a man who had already moved into a different century. The internal monologue of my quiet rebuild was one of clinical, detached observation of my own progress, a tallying of wins that required no audience. I revamped my entire lifestyle, from the way I ate to the way I processed information, shedding the emotional weight of the past like old skin. I realized that I had been carrying a burden that wasn't mine to bear, a responsibility for Ava's happiness that she had never intended to reciprocate. The rising psychological pressure was now a fuel, a steady burn that pushed me through 14-hour workdays and the occasional fleeting pang of a memory I no longer nurtured. Have you ever felt the sheer weight of your own potential once the distractions are finally removed? Noah Blake's name started appearing in the business journals, but not for the reasons he would have wanted. His firm was facing scrutiny for aggressive accounting practices that smelled of desperation. I realized that the man Ava had chosen for his perceived stability and status was built on the same shifting sands as their relationship. I stayed silent because I didn't need to sabotage him. Men like Noah are their own greatest enemies, eventually tripping over the egos they spend so much time polishing. That was the moment I understood that time is the ultimate arbiter of truth, and I had more than enough time to wait for the inevitable. By the end of this period, I was no longer the man who had been left behind in a dark apartment. I was a figure of quiet, formidable influence in my industry. I had rebuilt my physical and financial health with a ferocity that left no room for the sentimental rot of my previous existence. I realized that I didn't want my old life back, nor did I want a new version of it. I wanted a life that was entirely unrecognizable to the person I used to be. The pressure in my chest was gone, replaced by a cold, humming engine of intent that didn't require external validation to keep running. Why do we fear the silence of a new beginning when it is the only place where we can truly hear ourselves think? The section concludes with a moment of pure, crystalline clarity during a late-night flight back from a successful deal in London. I looked down at the lights of New York, a city that had once felt like a battleground, and realized that I had already won the war by simply leaving the field. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A voicemail from an unknown number that I knew, with a sudden, intuitive certainty, belonged to Ava Sinclair. I didn't listen to it. I didn't even save it. I watched the city lights grow closer and realized that the question wasn't what she had to say, but why I had ever thought her voice was the only one that mattered. Section 6. Revenge. That doesn't look like revenge. The most effective way to destroy an ego is to become the one thing it cannot influence, a lesson I applied with surgical precision as my path inevitably crossed theirs again. I was invited to a private dinner for the city's top investors, an event so exclusive that even the waitlist had a waitlist. I knew Noah and Ava would be there, not as peers, but as guests of a secondary sponsor, a subtle distinction that signaled the shifting of the social tides. I dressed with a restrained elegance, a suit that cost more than their first 3 months of rent, tailored so perfectly it felt like a second skin. I realized that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to exist in the same room as the people who once tried to diminish it. Walking into that room was like stepping onto a stage where I already knew everyone's lines, but they had forgotten mine. I saw Ava first, her eyes widening as she noticed me, a flicker of something, regret, fear, or perhaps just shock, crossing her face before she could mask it with a practiced smile. Noah was beside her, looking slightly older and more tired than I remembered, his hand gripping his glass a little too tightly as he watched me approach. I stayed silent as I walked past them to greet the host, my focus entirely on the people who actually mattered in that environment. That was the moment I understood that the ultimate revenge isn't a confrontation. It's being so successful that your presence is a reminder of their failure. The psychological pressure in the room was palpable, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the corner where Noah and Ava were standing. They were watching me navigate the room with an ease that comes only from genuine confidence, seeing me engage with people they had spent years trying to impress. I realized that by not acknowledging them, I was stripping away the only leverage they still thought they had, the history we shared. Every time Ava tried to catch my eye, I was already looking elsewhere, my attention a scarce commodity that I was no longer willing to trade for her attention. Why does the person who once meant everything to you become a stranger the moment you stop needing their approval? Internal monologue is a fascinating thing when you are standing 5 feet away from the person who broke your heart and feeling absolutely nothing but a mild curiosity. I watched Noah try to insert himself into a conversation I was having with a major developer, his tone desperate and his facts slightly out of date. I stayed silent as he spoke, letting his own inadequacy hang in the air for a few seconds too long before turning back to my original partner with a polite, dismissive nod. I realized that I didn't need to humiliate him. His own lack of depth was doing the work for me in a room full of people who valued substance over style. That was the moment I understood that competence is a shield that no amount of charisma can penetrate. The dinner was a masterclass in social hierarchy, and for the first time in my life, I was at the top of the pyramid looking down. Ava was seated 3 places away from me, forced to listen as the host praised my recent acquisitions and my visionary approach to market volatility. I could feel her gaze on me, heavy with the weight of everything she had thrown away for a man who was now visibly struggling to keep up with the conversation. I stayed silent because my story was being told by the people she respected most, a narrative of triumph that didn't require a single word from my own lips. Have you ever realized that your greatest defense is the life you have built for yourself while no one was watching? Madeline Price approached me during the dessert course, her usual venom replaced by a forced, sycophantic warmth that made my stomach turn. "Julian, we've all been so impressed by your success. We really should all get together soon," she said, her eyes darting toward Ava to see if she was watching our interaction. I looked at her with a calm, steady expression and said nothing, a silence that stretched until she awkwardly excused herself and retreated to the safety of the bar. I realized that these people were like vultures. They only circled the successful, and I was now the largest target on their horizon. That was the moment I understood that the same people who celebrate your downfall will be the first to claim they always believed in your rise. The rising psychological pressure reached a breaking point when the party moved to a smaller, more intimate lounge for late-night drinks and cigars. Ava found me alone for a moment near the balcony, the same setting where our relationship had first begun to fracture a year ago. "Julian, can we talk? Just for a minute?" she asked, her voice low and stripped of the arrogance that had defined her departure. I stayed silent for a long beat, looking at her not with anger, but with a profound, detached pity that seemed to unsettle her more than a shouting match ever could. I realized that she was looking for a way back in, a crack in the wall I had built, but she found only a smooth, impenetrable surface. "I have nothing to say to you, Ava," I finally said, my voice quiet and even, devoid of the emotional turbulence she was expecting to exploit. I didn't wait for her response. I simply walked away, leaving her standing in the shadows of a world that no longer had a place for her. I realized that her power over me had been a hallucination, a spell that only worked as long as I agreed to believe in it. The pressure was gone, replaced by a sense of total, unburdened freedom that made the night air feel like a celebration of my own resilience. Why do we think we need closure from others when the only real closure comes from the moment we stop looking back? Noah was waiting for her near the exit, his face a mask of frustration and a growing realization that his trophy was no longer enough to mask his own professional stagnation. I walked past them both, my pace steady and my head held high, a man who had not only survived a betrayal, but had used it as a catalyst for a transformation they couldn't even comprehend. I stayed silent as the valet brought my car, a vehicle that was a statement of intent in itself, and drove away into the heart of a city that finally felt like mine again. I realized that the best revenge isn't making them suffer. It's making them irrelevant to the story of your life. The section ends with me arriving at my apartment, the silence of the space no longer feeling like an absence, but like a presence, a sanctuary I had earned through restraint and timing. I looked at my reflection in the window and saw a man I finally respected, a person whose value was no longer tied to the whims of a woman or the approval of a social circle. My phone buzzed with a notification of a new deal closing, a final confirmation that my private rebuild was complete and my public dominance was just beginning. I realized that the fire had finally gone out, leaving behind not ash but a diamond that had been forged in the very heat that was meant to destroy it. But as I sat in the quiet, one final question lingered in the back of my mind. Would they ever realize that their biggest mistake wasn't leaving me, but letting me find out who I was without them? Section 7. When they finally noticed the absence. The silence I had cultivated was no longer a shield. It had become a vacuum, a powerful force that was beginning to pull the remnants of Ava's world into its orbit. It is a strange phenomenon. The more you refuse to look back, the more desperately the past tries to catch your eye. I received a frantic call from Madeline Price late on a Tuesday, her voice lacking its usual sharp, predatory edge. "Julian, it's about Ava. They aren't good. Noah's firm is being liquidated, and he's taking it out on everyone around him." I stayed silent, listening to the static on the line, realizing that I felt no surge of triumph, only a cold, clinical recognition of an inevitable result. Why does the collapse of a false idol always feel so quiet when it finally happens? The psychological pressure was now entirely on Ava, who found herself trapped in the very life she had traded me for. She had sought status, but she found a sinking ship. She had sought passion, but she found a man whose ego was tied to a bank account that was rapidly hitting zero. I realized that my absence was the only thing she couldn't manage. I wasn't there to provide the emotional labor of her recovery, and I wasn't there to be the villain in her story. I was simply gone. That was the moment I understood that the most terrifying thing you can do to an attention seeker is to stop providing the stage. I was the audience that walked out in the middle of her favorite scene, and the theater had stayed dark ever since. Ethan Cross met me for lunch at a private club, the kind of place where the waiters know your name but never speak it. He laid a newspaper on the table, pointing to a small headline about Noah Blake's legal troubles. "He's finished, Julian, and Ava is trying to spin it as her being the loyal partner, but no one is buying it anymore. They're looking for you, you know. They want to see the man who survived." I looked at the headline and then back at my coffee, the information sliding off me like water off glass. I stayed silent because I didn't want to participate in the post-mortem of their failure. I was too busy living in the vitality of my own success. Have you ever noticed that the higher you climb, the less you care about the weather at the bottom of the mountain? Internal monologue is a luxury of the successful, a private dialogue with one's own growth that requires no external validation. I found myself thinking about the night Ava left, the way she had looked at me with that flicker of doubt, and I realized that was the last moment she was actually powerful. The moment she stepped out that door, she lost the only person who saw her as something more than a social asset. I stayed silent because my words would have been a lifeline, and I had long since cut the rope. The pressure was rising in her circle as the invitations dried up and the phone stopped ringing, a slow-motion social death that I was witnessing from a safe, comfortable distance. I began to receive messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, friends of Ava, who were suddenly interested in my new ventures and my refined lifestyle. Rachel Vaughn was the only one I allowed through the filter, her sharp eyes seeing the transition for exactly what it was. "You didn't just rebuild, Julian, you evolved," she said during a brief encounter at a gallery opening. "They're waiting for you to gloat. They're waiting for the 'I told you so.' It's driving them mad that it never comes." I realized then that my silence was a form of psychological torture for them, a riddle with no answer that they would spend the rest of their lives trying to solve. Why is a lack of revenge more painful to the guilty than a direct attack? The status threat was now a reality for Noah, who was being systematically erased from the very boardrooms he used to dominate. I saw him at a distance once, standing outside a courthouse, looking small and defeated in a suit that no longer seemed to fit him. There was no anger in me, only a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the man I had become. I stayed silent because any interaction would have lowered me to his level, and I had worked too hard to climb this high. That was the moment I understood that true dominance is when your enemy's downfall is merely a footnote in your morning briefing. The rising psychological pressure reached a peak when Ava showed up at my office building, a desperate final attempt to reclaim a narrative she had lost. I watched her from the security monitors in the lobby, seeing her argue with the receptionist, her movements jerky and her face strained with the effort of maintaining a facade that had already cracked. I didn't go down, and I didn't send a message. I simply told security that I wasn't expecting any visitors. I realized that the woman on that screen was a stranger to me, a ghost of a past life that had no place in my present. Had you ever realized that the person you once loved was just a character you helped create? I sat in my office, the sun setting over the city, casting long shadows across the floor, and felt a deep, resonant peace. The silence was no longer heavy, it was light, a space filled with the potential of everything I had yet to do. I stayed silent because the work was done, the lesson was learned, and the debt was paid in full. I realized that the absence they were noticing wasn't just my physical presence, but the absence of the man they thought they could control. The pressure had shifted entirely, a weight that was now theirs to carry until the end of their social lives. As I prepared to leave for the night, my phone buzzed with one final text from Ava. "I made a mistake. Please." I looked at the screen, the 5 words glowing in the dim light of the office, and I felt nothing. No spark of old love, no heat of old anger. I stayed silent because a response would be a confirmation that she still mattered, and I was no longer interested in lying to either of us. I realized that the mistake wasn't hers to fix, it was mine to move past, and I had already traveled further than she could ever follow. That was the moment I understood that the ultimate power isn't in having the last word, but in no longer needing to speak at all. The section ends with me walking out of the building into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting in the glass of the skyscrapers like 1,000 eyes. I didn't look back at the lobby where she had been standing, and I didn't check my phone to see if she had sent another message. I realized that the vacuum I had created was finally full, not with her, but with a version of myself that was complete and unshakable. The question wasn't what would happen to her now, but what I would do with the silence that I had finally, truly mastered. I stepped into the back of my car and gave the driver a destination that was miles away from anything I had ever known. Section 8. What Power Feels Like After Desire Burns Out. The final realization of power isn't a crown or a throne. It is the absolute, unshakable indifference to the opinions of those who once sought to break you. A year had passed since the night I walked away from the old apartment, and my life was now a fortress of quiet productivity and high-level influence. I was invited to speak at a major economic summit, a stage reserved for the architects of the future, not the performers of the present. As I stood at the podium looking out at a sea of faces that represented the global elite, I realized that I didn't see a single person from my past. That was the moment I understood that the ultimate victory is outgrowing the world that once humiliated you. Noah Blake was no longer a name spoken in these rooms, and Ava Sinclair had become a cautionary tale whispered in the powder rooms of the social clubs she once haunted. I stayed silent during my speech, using pauses to emphasize the weight of my points, a command of the room that I had learned in the quiet of my own rebuilding. I realized that my voice now carried a weight that passion could never provide, the weight of competence, of survival, and of a total lack of desperation. Why do we think we need the fire of desire to be powerful when the cold clarity of purpose is so much more effective? I felt the audience leaning in, drawn to the restraint that had become my signature. After the summit, I attended a small, private dinner where the guest list was restricted to the evening speakers and their peers. Rachel Vaughn was there, looking more elegant and observant than ever, her presence a reminder of the few people who had seen the transition from the beginning. "They say you're the new gold standard for the silent move, Julian," she said, her voice a mix of admiration and a challenge. "Ava's been trying to write a memoir, you know, a tell-all about the high-stakes world. She can't even get a meeting." I stayed silent, offering only a small, polite smile that signaled my lack of interest in the gossip of the fallen. I realized that her attempt to sell our story was her final admission that she had nothing else left to offer the world. The psychological pressure of my dominance was now a permanent fixture in the minds of those who had witnessed my rise from the ash. I didn't need to gloat because the results were everywhere, in the deals I closed, the companies I moved, and the way the room shifted when I entered it. I realized that the people who had once pitied me were now the ones hoping for a moment of my time, a reversal of status that was as natural as it was earned. I stayed silent because my time was now my most valuable asset, and I was no longer giving it away to those who hadn't earned a seat at my table. That was the moment I understood that respect is a product of what you refuse to tolerate. Internal monologue had evolved into a state of constant, calm assessment, a mental clarity that allowed me to see through the noise of the world with ease. I thought about the man I was when I first met Ava, the boy who thought a fast love was a deep one, and I felt a sense of gratitude for his death. I realized that the betrayal hadn't destroyed me, it had cleared away the clutter of a life I wasn't meant to lead. I stayed silent because there was no one left to argue with, and no points left to prove. The pressure of the past had been completely vented, leaving behind a vacuum that I had filled with a quiet, enduring strength. Have you ever felt the peace of a battlefield after the smoke is finally cleared and you're the only one left standing? I saw Ava one last time, purely by chance, in the lobby of a hotel in Zurich where I was staying for a weekend of skiing. She was with a man who looked like a cheaper, louder version of Noah, her smile brittle and her eyes searching the room for anyone who might recognize her. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and I saw the recognition hit her like a physical blow. The realization that I was exactly who she always wanted, and that she was the reason I had become him. I stayed silent, not out of malice, but because there was truly nothing left to say. I gave her a polite, distant nod, the kind you give to a former acquaintance whose name you can't quite remember, and I walked toward the elevator. The rising psychological pressure of that moment was all hers to deal with, a crushing weight of "what if" that would likely follow her for the rest of her life. I realized that my indifference was the final nail in the coffin of our shared history, a refusal to even be her enemy. I stayed silent as the elevator doors closed, the smooth ascent to my penthouse suite, a metaphor for the trajectory of my life. I realized that I didn't want her to suffer. I just wanted her to be irrelevant, and I had finally achieved that state of grace. That was the moment I understood that the most successful form of revenge is when you no longer remember why you wanted it in the first place. Moral closure doesn't come with a speech or a grand gesture. It comes with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a character well forged. I sat on my balcony overlooking the Swiss Alps, the air crisp and clean, and I felt a sense of alignment that was deeper than anything I had ever experienced with Ava. I realized that the love I had been searching for in others was actually the respect I had needed for myself. I stayed silent because the mountains were enough, the silence was enough, and I was more than enough. The journey from humiliation to dominance was complete, not because I had won, but because I had stopped playing a losing game. The story ends not with a confrontation, but with a quiet, dignified exit from the narrative of others. I looked at the stars and realized that I was no longer a character in anyone else's play. I was the author of my own, and the script was finally mine to write. I stayed silent as I went back inside, the warmth of the room, a contrast to the cold beauty of the peaks, and I closed the door on the world I had left behind. I realized that the ultimate power feels like nothing at all. It feels like breath, like heartbeat, like the steady, silent pulse of a man who knows exactly who he is and exactly what he is worth. The fire had burned out, the ash had blown away, and what remained was indestructible. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.